And now I'd like to thank Dr. Helen Bannan, who retired from UW-Oshkosh as Director of Women's Studies and Associate Professor of History, for making possible Mrs. Hooper's appearance here today. Let's give Mrs. Hooper a warm welcome.
Thank you. Okay, I'm really grateful to the League of Women Voters for arranging to get me back to celebrate once again what was really one of the happiest days of my life, when Wisconsin became the first state to ratify the women's suffrage amendment, the 19th Amendment, the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, all the different ways we think of that amendment. It was something that I had spent a decade of my life working with every fiber of my being to bring into action. If you ever hear people say, well, women got the vote, women really worked hard to get the vote. It wasn't an easy thing. And what I'm going to hopefully do today is explain how I worked with many other women from Oshkosh and from throughout the state and really throughout the country by the end of the campaign to become full-fledged citizens in the country that we loved. And I'm delighted to be able to share that story with you. I will try to be brief enough that I leave some room for questions at the end. So I will get started. I wanted to explain, I am not a native of Wisconsin. I was born and raised in Iowa, in a very small town. First, I lived in a farm, and then a tiny hamlet, and then a small town. And when I married Ben Hooper and came to Oshkosh, this was really a big city to me. I was somewhat overwhelmed in some ways. I had never lived in such a large city. But my husband, Ben, was a marvelous man. I was very lucky, and I chose well. He was a very supportive husband. Shortly after we were married, he was a suffragist before I was. Shortly after we were married in 1888, and I moved to his hometown of Oshkosh, he said to me, we talk politics quite a bit, and you have your ideas and I have mine, and it doesn't seem fair that I'm the only one who gets to record my ideas, whose ideas get to make change in the community. So from now on, in alternate elections, I will vote my ticket, the people I want to vote for, and then in the next cycle, you give me a list of who I should vote for, and I promise I will vote your ticket. So I was the first woman in Wisconsin to have even half a vote. And I think I was thrilled about that, but it also made me realize how that wasn't enough. All women needed to be recognized as equals all the time, and that really helped propel me into the suffrage campaign. Ben also encouraged me to join women's clubs, which were something of a new thing in the late 1800s. And the first club that he pushed me to join was the Ladies' Benevolent Society, which I understood was one of the sponsors for this. And that was I think it was the first women's club here in Oshkosh. It was founded during the Civil War to help the women whose husbands were fighting in the Civil War when they needed help, because they often did, to keep their families going. And after the Civil War ended, they helped with the war widows. And their first project that I was involved with after I joined was building what they called a home for the friendless, which turned out to be mostly older widows. I don't think they were friendless when they were younger. I think their friends died off. And we, the Ladies' Benevolent Society, established a home for them, and they made friends among the other people who lived in that house. So it was a really important thing to bring to Oshkosh. After another women's club got started, which was called the 20th Century Club, and we were forward-looking. We used that title in think it was 1896 when we were getting started. I was one of the founding members of the club. And this was a very large club. It had a lot of different departments. There was a department of art in which Sophie Guden, who was an immigrant from Germany, who was very highly educated, she gave us, I think, what would be the equivalent today, in my day, of a course in art history. Every year, we studied the art of a different time and place under Mrs. Guden's guidance. There was also a music section, a music department, and we put on free concerts for the people, particularly in the winter when we needed things to do indoors. There was a civics department, and that was the department that I particularly loved because we got working to bring new ideas to fruition to help improve the community. Now, it always seemed to me when I looked at politics that the men in politics were very concerned about money. Politics seemed to be a lot about money. But the women who were involved in community work, it was all about people. And when they moved into politics, they were trying to make politics work for people, to bring help and important improvements to the community. And that's what I wanted to do. And when I got involved with suffrage, that was my idea, that I thought if I could help get political power to the women, the people who bring all the people into the world would be a better place. So that was part of my rationale. Now, I've made my first suffrage speech in Oshkosh in 1909. And at this time, women had what they called school suffrage. It was a partial form of suffrage. They were allowed to vote only on issues, on matters that related to schools, such as voting for the superintendent of schools or voting for school bonds to build a new high school or something like that. Now, Olympia Brown, who was the president of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association from, I think it was 1883, it was before I arrived in Wisconsin, until 1913. She was one of the first women to be ordained a minister in the United Church of Christ. She came to Wisconsin as called to be a pastor of a parish in Racine. Olympia Brown, as in the 1880s, pushed a law through for this partial school suffrage. And she had it in her head that you could make school suffrage expand. You could consider just about any bill as having, or any election, having some connection to schools. So she went to Racine to vote in an election, but they turned her away at the polls because they said, you're not allowed to vote. You have only the special thing for schools, and this is a general election for the council, the city council. She contested it, brought the case all the way up to the state Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, on a technicality, ruled that when they passed that law for allowing women to vote for school issues, they didn't provide enough guidance for how this should be implemented. And none of the municipalities or the state government wasn't willing to push, even though the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association was pushing to get that law really alive. So it was passed in the 1880s, and it wasn't really realized until the early years of the 20th century, when the women who were involved in the Wisconsin Federation of Women's Clubs got together and really pushed on a united basis to make that old law live again by providing a mechanism where women could cast their ballots. They had to provide a separate ballot box where the women would put their ballots that only had on it anything to do with school and put that into the ballot box. So I think the stories like this give you a sense of how hard it was in the early days to get any kind of movement, to get really the full thing of suffrage was, and as it took, 1848 was the first women's rights convention in Seneca Falls, and they proposed then that women should have the vote. It took a long time for that to happen, and it was a lot of women working for little bits of change along the way. Now, when I was encouraging women to use the school suffrage, I was thinking in my mind, it's sort of like when there's a child at a banquet and they give the child a cookie or a graham cracker and everybody else is eating the full meal. Well, when you give partial suffrage, just voting for school things, it's like you're at the kiddie table gnawing your graham cracker. But it's still, I argued that it was really important for women to show that they wanted the vote, because many anti-suffrage people didn't believe that really women wanted the vote. And we really did, and I think all the years of struggle brought that out. Now, in my work in civic betterment, to use a phrase, made me realize how much we really needed women's suffrage. I was working on a project to build a county tuberculosis sanatorium in the decade of the 1910s. We started the project in about 1910. And at that time, there was only one public sanatorium in the state of Wisconsin. And there were thousands of people with tuberculosis. It was rampant in that era, and there was not a good cure. So as someone who had a great deal of health issues when I was younger, I really understood how a family was afraid of tuberculosis and how we needed some place where patients could be cared for with that disease. So I helped my 20th century civics department, worked with the physicians in town, and with eventually the county board of supervisors formed a committee, and there were 3 women on it, Mrs. Myrtle McIver and Miss, can't remember her name now. It's hard when you get to be over 100, you know. Maybe it'll come to me later. Okay, and there were only 3 women. And they assigned us, of course, the duty of writing up the report, the plan that we had devised as a committee. And we wrote it up and we submitted it to the committee. And then we had to go to Madison to talk to the legislature, because the legislature had to vote to enact a law to enable counties to have an institution like a tuberculosis sanatorium. When we got to Madison, the legislators didn't talk to the 3 of us who had written the report. Mary Forbes was the other one. I knew it would come. But they didn't talk to Mary or Myrtle or me. They just talked to the men. They looked right over our heads, and we were the ones who had really carefully thought out the plan. So that made me feel that without the vote, our work in civic betterment was like trying to dig a hole with a teaspoon. What we needed was a steam shovel, and the vote could be our steam shovel. And so that was what I decided at that point. This is where I was going to put my energy. At the time, I was the president of the 20th Century Club, so I needed to finish my commitment to that club. But I really began my full-time focus on women's suffrage soon after that. In 1911, the legislature voted to set up a referendum on the issue of women's suffrage. Now, women had been arguing for this to happen for many years. They had proposed it in many previous sessions of the legislature. But in 1911, State Senator David James from Richland Center, and know where Richland Center is? It's a very small town in the southwest corner of Wisconsin. And they had probably more suffragists per capita than any place on earth, because it was a very small town. And David James and his wife, Laura Briggs James, were both suffragists. Laura died in 1905, but they had 3 daughters, and their oldest daughter, Ada, was a strong suffragist too. And Ada James and her father crafted the bill that the legislature finally passed to set up a suffrage referendum. And the Wisconsin Constitution required that to extend suffrage to a new group of people, you had to have a referendum among the existing electorate to kind of welcome them in to the electorate. So we had to go through this process. And we thought that we could do it, that we could convince enough men, and only the men got to vote. Women couldn't vote for themselves to get the ballot. We thought we could do it, and we worked extremely hard for it. Ada and a group of us who had been very active in women's clubs work wanted to have a more aggressive campaign style than the kind of 19th century style that Olympia Brown had used. And she was still president of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association. Ada James was the vice president, and feeling very frustrated. And so Ada, after there were hearings on the bill, and after the Senate passed it first, or the Assembly passed it first, after that happened, Ada called a meeting, and several of us from Oshkosh went. I went. Sophie Gooden, who I mentioned before, she was very involved with suffrage. She was also the president of the State Consumers League that tried to encourage people to buy only the product of fairly paid waged labor, not sweatshop labor. And who else? Mary Radford, who was a friend of mine, and Rose Swart, who worked at the Normal, at Oshkosh Normal, and she was in charge of training teachers. She was the teacher who set up the student teachers and trained teachers. So these were very high-powered women, and I went down with them. And we all joined what became the Political Equality League. And we favored techniques like standing on street corners and talking, because we needed to be able to reach the men. They were the ones who were voting. The old 19th century practice was to meet in churches or in women's parlors and just talk to each other. We had to get beyond that to talk to the people who were voting. We also started car rides. I'm sure you've seen photos. I think I saw one on my way in of the women in a car with a banner that said "Votes for Women," and sometimes we would have somebody playing a bugle to call attention to ourselves, and then someone would stand up in the car. They had open-top cars at the time, and gave a speech and then moved to the next place. Well, one time when we were doing that in Fond du Lac, a man who had a little bit too much to drink came and ripped the banner from our car, and a policeman arrested him for that. And the policeman said, "Do you ladies want to press charges?" And we said, "Well, we really didn't care if the man was put in jail, but that banner cost us $2. And he said, "Well, if he pays you the $2, then you won't press charges." And we said, "Right," and that's what we did. So just these kinds of incidents, I think, give you some idea. We had a lot of fun. We were working very hard, but we enjoyed working with each other, and we enjoyed the process of working to do something for ourselves, but also for all women for all time. We really thought we were doing something very important. And when we had the date for the referendum was set for the 5th of November, in 1912. So we had about 18 months to do all this activism, and we thought we were doing very well. We were reaching out to a lot of people. But there were some technicalities that we didn't foresee. And when they had the election, we lost by a 2-to-1 margin. It was really crushing. We were very upset. And we figured out, had a meeting afterwards to figure out why. And part of the reason why was the strength of the liquor industry in Wisconsin, because they were really afraid. So many of us women, myself included, were very in favor of temperance. And the liquor interests were very afraid that if women got in, they would enforce prohibition. They would vote that into law. And they also, the state legislature had, I think, pulled a little trick on us. Sometime after the women's suffrage referendum date had been set, they passed a rule that any referendum had to be on a separate ballot than the regular ballot for the election. But they only applied it to a referendum that was acted upon after a certain date. And the date was just before they passed the women's suffrage date. So only the women's suffrage issue was on its own separate ballot. And they made that ballot, guess what color? Pink. Pink ballots. And so the people who own bars, the people who put ads in the newspaper about this election said, vote no on the pink ballot. It was really pretty easy for that to be voted down. There were more pink ballots voting no than there were any kind of, the regular ballots, votes for any, positive votes for any candidate statewide or any of the other issues. That people were going to the polls just to vote against women's suffrage. And so that made us feel angry, disappointed, but determined. We were going to get it done anyway, even in spite of this. So we kept things up. I had a hard time for a little while because personally, my daughter had graduated from the University of Wisconsin at Madison the previous June to the election. And while we were at her graduation, my mother fell and broke her hip, and she had been failing since then. And she died 2 days before the election. So I was crushed to begin with. And then my father, who was very active and got sick in early December and died by the middle of December. It was just a crushing season for me. So at that point, my very kind husband, Ben, knew that my sister and her 2 daughters were going down to Texas for the winter. They said, you should go with them so you can get some relaxation and get away from everything and relax. So I did. I went with them. And when I started to give suffrage talks in Texas, I figured it was time for me to go back home. And I did. And in 1913, the old Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association merged again with the Political Equality League, and we became a united front working for suffrage. We continued to work for the same sorts of outward public meetings and speeches, etc., to try to bring people along. It was very important for us to keep working and to try to keep convincing people any way we could. We had a number of different ways to raise funds so we could distribute literature about women's suffrage. We were very active and very committed. So that was 1915. In in this time period, in 1915 and 1916, the war was happening in Europe, but it was not yet happening in the United States. But we all were watching very carefully and worrying what would happen. Within the National Women's Suffrage Association, there was a change in leadership in 1915, and a woman who was born in Wisconsin and moved to Iowa, sort of the opposite path that I had taken, became president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. That was Carrie Chapman Catt. And I had seen Mrs. Catt speak at a number of different women's suffrage conventions and also General Federation of Women's Club conventions. And I was convinced that this was the leader that could lead us to victory. She was very well organized, she was very smart, and a really good strategic thinker. She could think of strategies and figure out ways to go. And so I was thrilled when she became the president of the National American Women's Suffrage Association, which is a lot to say, so I'm going to say NAWSA after that. So NAWSA is that National American Women's Suffrage Association. At this time, I was elected, and I was no longer president of the 20th Century Club, and so I was elected to be legislative chair for the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, the WWSA. And as such, I was lobbying in Madison, trying to talk to the legislators to convince legislators to pass more suffrage legislation, but also to consider raising the age of consent from 12 and making it higher for girls. And we wanted to pass legislation that looked at the possibility of custody after a divorce going to women, not always to men. And we were raising more issues. We were not single issue people. We did consider other things, but the vote was really primary. But we tried to plant new seeds in people's minds. In 1916 was the election for that Woodrow Wilson was running on a platform of "He kept us out of war." And I was a big Wilson fan. I really liked him. But we, in the women's suffrage movement, were not politically party-oriented. We went to the Democratic Convention, we went to the Republican Convention, and the Republican Convention that year was in Chicago. So a delegation went from Wisconsin to join a suffrage parade that was at the Republican Convention. And we were walking around the city. We had a route plan that was approved by the city founders, and we had the worst weather you can imagine. You all live in Wisconsin. You know how thunderstorms can hit in July. Well, it was one of these storms when it was pouring, and thunder and wind. And we had little, I would call them pinnies, like a little tunic over our beautiful white suffrage white dresses. This was yellow, very cheap fabric and said Wisconsin on it. So we're walking in the rain with this, no umbrellas. And we get to the front door of the convention where we're going to make our grand entrance, and we were all like drowned rats. And someone was saying on the stage that women don't really want the vote. And then we marched in. The firefighters had a parade scheduled that day, and they canceled, and we walked. They couldn't say that we didn't want the vote. I think they didn't put a suffrage plank in the platform. Neither party did that year. But I think we impressed upon people's minds that some women really, really wanted the vote, and we certainly did. I had, in that year also, I went back to my native Iowa because they were having a referendum, a statewide election like we had in Wisconsin in 1912. And I spent 2 weeks in Iowa, first in the area around where I had grown up, and then they sent me to the big cities. We went to I was the first woman to speak on a street corner in Des Moines, Iowa. That's one of my accomplishments. And I spent a week in the town of Council Bluffs, Iowa, and I spoke sometimes 5 times in one day. Anyone who wanted me to speak, I was there. I went twice to speak at an African Methodist Episcopal Church, an AME Zion church in Council Bluffs, twice because they wanted me back. I did my best for Iowa, but Iowa, like Wisconsin, was not yet ready, and I was disappointed yet again. But we certainly did our all for that. By the end of 1916, I had been called by Mrs. Catt to do some lobbying work in the Congress, because in 1915, the first time that the suffrage amendment, the federal amendment that would bring suffrage to all American women once it was ratified, the suffrage amendment was brought to the House for a vote. And in that 1915 election, there were 11 members from Wisconsin. There were 2 men who were congressmen in Wisconsin who voted for women's suffrage. The other 9 voted against it because they had a perfect explanation for their vote. Well, my state just had a referendum, and my constituents want me to vote against this because that's how they voted in the election. So they used that referendum against us. But Mrs. Catt had a system of lobbying where she would send 2 women dressed very beautifully in suits and heels on those hard marble floors. But we walked the hard marble floors and talked to our legislators, tried to get to know them as individuals, tried particularly to get to know if their wives had any interest in suffrage, or their daughters, or anyone else that they might know. We tried to get them to reach them as people. And we were making some headway, I think. We got to know them, and they knew us as individuals. But it took a long time for that to filter through. And Wilson was elected, but he didn't keep us out of war very long. By February of 1917, it was very clear that the United States was considering going to war. And so Mrs. Catt, ever the strategist, called me and 99 other women's suffrage people to a meeting where we would discuss what we would do in the event of a war. In the Civil War, the people who had been working for women's suffrage decided they would stop working for women's suffrage for the duration of the war. They didn't work on women's suffrage. And then at the end of the war, when they voted to establish African American suffrage, they put the word male in the Constitution for the first time. And the suffragists were very disappointed, because previous to that, the word male was not in there in defining citizenship. So those women were very bitter at that time. But those of us who continued in the suffrage movement, we thought we need to support our country's activism in war. We need to be active on the home front, to roll bandages for the Red Cross if that was needed, to raise money for war bonds, to work when a lot of the food was going to our soldiers in France. We needed to establish meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays. There were a lot of strategies that people had developed to support the war. So we decided we would work to support the war effort, but we would also continue to work for suffrage. And so I became very active. Once the war started in April of 1917, I would go all around the state and speak about meatless Mondays and wheatless Wednesdays and growing gardens and buying war bonds. The Women's Suffrage Association had a hospital for orphans in France children who had been orphaned by the war, and we raised money for that. So we were very active. But in the evening, I would talk to the women who were involved in suffrage about how they could plan to elect legislators who would think favorably about suffrage. So we did have a dual campaign. By then, though, there was another wing in the suffrage movement, and that was Miss Alice Paul had developed. First it was called the Congressional Union, and then it was called the National Women's Party. And then Alice Paul had lived in England for a while and was very impressed by the really radical feminist suffragettes, they were called, in England, who used violent tactics sometimes and picketed and threw themselves in front of a horse at the big Derby Day. Anyway, they were much more radical. And Alice Paul's idea was that Woodrow Wilson was the president, the one in power, and she would blame Woodrow Wilson for not having pushed suffrage through. Our Constitution doesn't really work that way, and it does work that way in England. But Alice Paul and her Women's Party began to picket the White House during the war and burned President Wilson in effigy. Now, Ada James, who I've talked about a couple of times, she had joined the Alice Paul faction of suffrage by this time. But when they burned Wilson in effigy, she said, "That's too much even for me, and I've been a suffragist all my life." So there was a lot of controversy at that, but I think it's important to see that really extreme militancy, after these tactics had gone on for a while, they began to arrest the suffrage pickets and put them in a workhouse, and they went on a hunger strike, and they were force-fed. You want to talk about people proving that they really wanted the vote, that they would go through a lot for it. Alice Paul's party did that. But their radicalism made those of us who were in the NOSA appear much more okay, so to speak. These women are more normal. But I really think, I thought that at the time. I didn't say that out loud at the time, but I thought we need both types of people in this movement. And that in 1917, the tide was beginning to change. We were beginning to see more votes coming up in states and also in the federal Congress, and women's suffrage was coming closer. We could see it, we could feel it, but it took longer than we hoped. In 1918, there was to be, the House was considering once again the issue of women's suffrage, the suffrage amendment. And the National American Women's Suffrage Association met in its convention every December. And I went early to work the Congress as a lobbyist, and Mrs. Catt said to me, "You need to go immediately after this conference and go to lobby the districts 6, which included Oshkosh and Fond du Lac, and 9, which are, right in my neighborhood. 9 was Appleton and Green Bay. And you need to talk to the powerful men in every town in these districts and have them send telegrams to their legislators, their federal congressmen." So she sent me back to do this in January. We all know what it's like in January in Wisconsin. And this is 1918. I'm taking the train all through and getting off at every stop. And usually I knew some of the suffrage women at every stop, and I would talk to them. Who are the most important men? And I'd go to visit them and say, "Please, it's so close. We just need you to take some action. I know that you think it's important that women get the vote." So I worked myself sick. Literally, I was exhausted. Sometimes walking through snow up to my knees, going to these men's office and talking to them. Telephones were not as readily available. This was the way I could reach people, was to talk to them in person. So after doing this, I got on the train to get home when I wasn't able to do it anymore. And I kind of collapsed at home, and I could barely raise my head when Ben told me the news that they needed 2 votes, those 2 votes that I was trying to get. And both of those men voted for women's suffrage, and the House passed it with a 1-vote majority. So I was so happy. Of course, it takes 2 houses to get it through, and the Senate did not pass it in 1918. It did not pass, and the war ended, thank God, in November 11th, 1918. And the whole time I was selling war bonds, I was saying, we're doing this for the boys who are fighting in France. And now I wanted to work so that the boys who never came home from France would be the last of our boys that we would send to fight a war. I had been convinced by the horror of what they called the Great War that my next cause, once suffrage was finished, would be to end war. I just was totally committed to that, but I had to get that last little bit done. So we continued to fight for suffrage. And the House, once again, they needed another vote. The House was solidly on our side in 1919. I was once again the lobbyist. I asked to be lobbyist back in Madison to work with the new legislature. We had a dynamite legislature that year. They were really strong suffrage people. They voted for another suffrage referendum. I told them not to. I didn't want another referendum. I wanted the amendment. But they were so gung-ho. They also voted for presidential suffrage. We'd get another one of these little partial suffrages. We could vote for the electors who elect the president. And they also passed a memorandum advising the Senate to finally, please, pass the women's suffrage amendment. And the Senate finally did that in June 4th, I believe, of 1919. And so I was in Wisconsin. Mrs. Catt, who I really admired, had asked me, and Theodora Humans, who was the president of the Wisconsin Women's Suffrage Association, she had asked both of us to come to lobby the Senate in D.C. And I said, for the first time in my life, I said no to Mrs. Catt. I said, I want to be in Wisconsin. I want Wisconsin to show the country that we are not what you thought we were. When we lost that suffrage referendum so badly, I think that we should lead the pack. I wanted Wisconsin to come first, to ratify first. Our legislature was still meeting, and in many of the other states that wasn't true. So the bill came, the news of the official news of ratification, that the amendment was ready to be ratified, came to Wisconsin and to Illinois and to Michigan that were still voting, that were still in session. And Illinois voted at 10 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of June. Wisconsin voted at 11 o'clock in the morning on the 10th of June. So in terms of who voted, Illinois was first, but the document saying that the legislature had ratified this and the governor's signature on it had to be taken to Washington, D.C. And Ada James, who had been my friend in 1911, we were on different sides of the suffrage movement. She came to celebrate, to see this happen with her father, who was well into his 70s at the time. And Ada and I talked, and we decided we would get the governor to appoint her father to be the official messenger for suffrage. And so he did, and we had contact with the people who knew Washington, D.C., gave him very explicit directions, had to get to the Secretary of State's office from the train station. We didn't have a suitcase for him. Somebody ran out and got him a new shirt so he would look decent and put it in Ada's big handbag. And he carried Ada's big handbag with his new shirt and the precious, precious cargo of that certificate. Made it to D.C., made it to the Secretary of State office, and handed it in way before Illinois. So Wisconsin got there first. And it makes my heart just sing to see that Wisconsin is still celebrating 100 years later. And thank you very much. You've been a great audience. I'm sorry if I went longer than I should have, but I get kind of excited. I haven't been talking in a long time. Thank you. Thank you so much.